What does it mean to be human in a world disrupted by technological change, in an unprecedented way, at an unprecedented pace? How are emerging technologies transforming our societies, our personal identities, our values? Welcome to Disrupted Futures, a podcast brought to you by ESDiT, the Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies, a research program funded by the Dutch Research Council. I'm your host, Dr. Radhika Mittal, Program Manager and Impact Lead for ESDiT. In each episode, we try to uncover the ideas, the dilemmas, the ethical tensions shaping our future. We explore today's technological and societal transformations. From AI to robotics, from digital identity to sustainability, from democracy to well-being. Along with researchers, practitioners, and critical thinkers, we ask the questions of the future. This is Disrupted Futures. Let's think forward. I'm very, very happy today to welcome Sabine Roeser, who is a professor of ethics at TU Delft and a management board member at ESDiT, the Ethics of Socially Disruptive Technologies. Sabine's research focuses on risk, emotions, intuitions, and art. She takes us through the very interesting dynamics of morality, looked at through the lens of everyday human emotions like empathy and care, arguing that these can have a key role to play in decision-making about risky technologies. She also explores the importance of works of art and how they can contribute to emotional deliberation on risky technologies. Sabine is a widely published author and speaker with papers, books, and monographs in this field, and a sought-after expert in the Dutch media on topics related to technology developments and public health technologies. She is a member of various national and international policy advisory committees related to nuclear energy, genetic modification, climate policies, and public health. So a very interesting personality to talk to about the disruptions brought about by technologies and the ways in which our emotions can contribute to understanding them and thinking about possible futures. So welcome, Sabine.
Thank you very much, Radhika, for this very generous introduction, and great to be a part of this.
Sabine, you examine the role of emotions as a source of moral knowledge through which we can effectively deliberate on various disruptive technologies. Can you explain how emotions could play a role in this and in helping us develop the ethics of technology?
Thank you. Yes. So emotions are very frequently seen as a threat to sound decision making because people tend to take emotions as irrational, subjective states that are distracting from sound deliberation and knowledge. However, in the philosophy and psychology of emotions, there are a lot of researchers who have argued actually for millennia that emotions are important for decision making, and they're not irrational, but rather a source of practical rationality. They help us to make moral decisions, for example. In my research, I contribute to this discussion in general, but also specifically in the context of technology development and risky technology specifically. So I argue that emotions such as fear or anger or care are not irrational states, but rather states that help us be sensitive, be alert to ethical dimensions of technology and technology developments that might otherwise escape our attention.
That's actually very, very interesting because one would have not thought that we could study emotions in this context. What drew you to examine this aspect?
Thank you. Yeah, and for me, it's actually, I can't think of a more straightforward topic, but that's probably my own bias. So I worked on the role of emotions for moral knowledge already when I did my PhD, and my PhD was in what they call meta-ethics, so really the theoretical foundations of ethics. So there was no technology angle in there, and I was studying a certain branch of moral theory that emphasizes the importance of ethical intuitions, but then understood in a rational way. And I knew from the beginning that I started to work on this topic for my PhD, I need to have emotions in there. I studied a little bit about emotions during my master's, and I knew this has to be a central theme in my PhD. And in the end, that was the clue of my PhD thesis, to combine this ethical intuitionism with the role of emotions understood in the way that I mentioned before as a source of practical knowledge and cognition. And then when I started to work at TU Delft, by now more than 24 years ago, I knew immediately that this would also be really fruitful in the context of ethical decision making about technologies. Because if you think about public debates about technology developments, they're frequently very, very emotional. And understanding emotions correctly is a major challenge. And I argue in my work that they're usually understood incorrectly in a very misleading way due to this idea that emotions are by definition irrational and subjective. And then they're either dismissed or they're taken as endpoints of discussion. I turn it around and say that should be the starting point of our discussion, because then we get the ethical issues to the fore.
Sabine, I really liked what you said about studying emotions and putting them at the center, because this means we're putting the human at the center, and that is so important today in a world driven by logic and practicality and big decision making in corporate boardrooms and tables and all these offices around the world. So I'm glad that you're putting the human back into these decisions or these decision making practices. This is not easy to do, but I want to ask you to summarize your work or the main insights from your work in 3 hashtags. Do you think you can attempt this?
Thanks for the question, Radhika. So here are my 3 hashtags. Hashtag number 1, emotions are needed for moral knowledge. Hashtag number 2, emotions shed light on ethical aspects of risk. Hashtag number 3, art can help in emotional deliberation on risk.
Sabine, you said a lot there, even though there were just 3 hashtags. And let's see if we can unpack some of that, right, through the work that you've been doing. And I think the best way to relate to your work, because it's theoretical in nature and because everybody thinks of emotions in different ways, could you perhaps give us practical examples or case scenarios where emotional deliberation can help us mitigate risk, or where we can develop guidelines when we are confronted with techno-social change? So perhaps an example that focuses on the individual and another example that focuses on transformation that is more systemic.
Thank you, Radhika. I'm happy to do that. So maybe starting with an individual example, I've done quite some research in the past on the role of breastfeeding versus bottle feeding. Now you might think, well, that's not a technology, but in a way, bottle formula for baby food is a technologically produced substance. And it's a very, very hotly debated topic. And there's a lot of pressure on new mothers to breastfeed their babies. And most mothers want to do that, but a lot of them don't succeed. And the official breastfeeding information repeats over and over again, everybody can do it. You just need to, which actually for a lot of women adds insult to injury and makes it even harder because it's already a very existential experience. And what is really strange about it is that it's a standard principle in medical ethics that we cannot force people against their will to use a certain medical treatment or technology. And here, maybe because the gender dimension is involved here, I pose this as a rhetorical question. We see that this principle is shunned in all the official information. It's repeated over and over again that breastfeeding is the best for the baby and that you really have to try it. But the second part is already forcing people into something. But the first part is also not uncontroversial. When I did research on this topic with my colleague Jessica Niljen-Falkvist from Sweden, we found out that there are also a lot of studies that show that certain health claims about breastfeeding are not unanimously lead to positive results. Actually, there are also studies that show that certain health benefits do not actually occur, or that there's a neutral effect. For example, that children are supposed to have less allergies due to breastfeeding. There are also studies that show the opposite, probably because of not enough exposure to allergens, etc. So this is not to say that we should go to the opposite direction and say breastfeeding is bad. Of course, it's wonderful, and for those who can do it, can be a great experience. But let's give balanced information that is not lopsided, because this way you're shunning the autonomy of women. You're not respecting the emotions that they experience when they are struggling with breastfeeding. We're not taking into account available alternatives, such as bottle feeding. It's presented as something dangerous, even in a lot of information. So this is a very, very problematic case where a lot of the ground rules for medical ethical information are not respected. And we see dimensions that we know from the literature on risk ethics occur here in this very specific case from risk ethics. We know that dimensions such as autonomy, available alternative, justice and fairness are really important. And in my research, I show that emotions are important ways to make these ethical issues salient. So in this case, it can maybe get as close as possible to one's very personal existence. So this is a small case, small in quotation marks, because it's probably experienced for the women in question who have problems breastfeeding as one of a very large issue, actually. But then we see, if we go to a very different technology, when I was writing that paper with my colleague back then, I was also working on ethical aspects of nuclear energy. Well, there's something small in there, like splitting the atom, but what comes out of it is pretty gigantic. So it's a technology on a very different scale. But you can see that the same ethical considerations on an abstract level play a role, such as autonomy, available alternatives, justice and fairness, and that here also emotions are usually dismissed as supposedly irrational. If somebody says, I'm worried about nuclear energy, typically the standard expert will say, well, you don't understand the statistics, listen to me, I'm the expert. But the experts are maybe in that case not listening to the ethical concerns underlying the emotions that people may experience. In the case of nuclear energy, the likelihood of a meltdown, for example, is extremely low. But when it happens, it's maybe one of the largest technological disasters we can even think of. The risks and benefits are often also distributed in an unequal way. People living closer to a nuclear power plant are more directly affected. We see that with the meltdowns at Chernobyl and Fukushima, where people cannot return to their homes. And in the case of Chernobyl, people are also have health effects that have been detrimental to a lot of people. So these are all important concerns to take into account, and there are available alternatives. And of course, we shouldn't have more fossil fuel technologies, energy technologies. those are also extremely problematic. But thinking about investing more in sustainable energy sources is a reasonable concern. I'm not here propagating a stance pro or against nuclear energy. I'm just trying to highlight that these emotional responses actually have underlying ethical concerns that are extremely important, that should be taken seriously, but are excluded usually from the decision making.
Right. That's actually very informative, very enlightening, because what you did just now is you took a very small basic technology like the bottle with which you breastfeed a child, which is, I think, in today's world, in the modern space, we really don't even consider that a technology. We take it for granted. This just exists, right? And you have crossed the spectrum from the breastfeeding bottle to nuclear energy. It's fascinating. And I really also thought your the gendered lens on who gets heard and who doesn't get heard, and also a community lens on who gets heard and who doesn't get heard in the case of nuclear energy are very relevant. So in that sense, my next question leads to, it seems to be very important to examine whose emotions matter. So do you have an insight into collective emotions versus individual emotions, or emotions that certain groups may highlight or be able to activate on, right, versus other groups who do not have that power to activate? And how does this impact the future of our socio-technical shifts?
Thank you. That's a great question. Indeed, maybe there's already a bias starting with that the emotions of the dominant group are not even identified as emotions. So the expert who gets angry at the stupid public who doesn't get their message is also displaying emotions. The expert who's super enthusiastic about the technology that they're developing, that's also an emotion that may introduce certain biases. But experts and policymakers tend to see themselves as purely rational, not hindered by any emotions. But of course, they are to some extent, and for the better or worse. Emotions can also lead to a sense of responsibility. But in the examples that I gave, in those cases, it was the expert versus the emotional layperson. And that is how the discourse is often framed, that experts and policy makers are purely rational, work with purely rational methods, and there's no room for the emotions, which means that the public is basically excluded and all kinds of stakeholders from the decision making. And so are the values and emotions that they have. On the other side of the spectrum is what I call the populist approach. So the first one is what I call the technocratic approach. The second is what I call the populist approach. Their policymakers say, for example, well, we know that this is the best technology, but unfortunately the public is too emotional because they're too irrational, so we cannot push the technology through. We've seen this in the Netherlands with various energy technologies, for example, such as shale gas, and other energy technologies, where the debate never even came off the ground because policymakers faced resistance by the public, and then they said, there's no point in engaging here with the public to try to see whether this technology might make sense. Now, you might think that I would applaud to this response, but the label populism is rarely meant as a compliment, and also not in this case, because again, there was not a real deliberation, there was no discussion, the values have not been identified, the public has not been taken seriously as epistemic agents, as agents who really bring something important, substantive to the debate. And that's why I think this approach is also mistaken, and it also misses out on the opportunity to also clarify what are the ethical issues here at stake versus maybe supposed misunderstandings of the technology, which is the only explanation that the standard approaches have to people's emotions. People respond emotionally because they don't understand the scientific information. But again, we miss out on the values that are underlying the emotions of the public. So it's typically the public, it's underrepresented groups whose emotions are excluded from these discussions, or if they're included, then only in a very instrumental, pragmatic way.
Right. How can we go about identifying these emotions, attaching values? What is this process then that you would recommend of emotional deliberation?
Well, the notion deliberation already says it, I guess. Let's talk about our emotions and the underlying values. Let's really have a conversation with each other. And I think one of the misunderstandings is often that controversial issues are framed as debates, where everybody more or less already has their predefined positions, and then we try to have a battle where we try to convince each other that oneself is right and the other person is wrong. Deliberation is something completely different. Deliberation requires an open-minded attitude where you go into the deliberation and say, this is how I feel about this, these are my values, these are my beliefs, but I'm here to listen to what the others have to say as well. And that might actually help me to reconsider certain views that I have, maybe bring in more nuance, or maybe really completely revise certain views that I have. But we need to engage in this exchange and learn from each other. And that's something that the current setup for public conversations is not in this way.
So you're really talking about kind of public engagement, stakeholder engagement, and community discourse. These are the things that I have been championing for a long time. So I really find it heartening to hear you, put them in the front and center of this conversation. We're living in an age of major technologically fueled disruptions, right? There are multiple transformations taking place at the same time in an accelerated manner. Can you help us think about the big socio-technical issues that are currently underway and in a disruptive manner, of course, and then the role of emotions in ethically examining these issues, one or two, or as you wish. And I will just follow up also with that when we discuss these issues and the emotions in ethically examining them, what are the most common hopes or fears or misconceptions that people have when we talk about this tech disruption?
Thank you for the very rich question. Let me just add one little point at the beginning before I dive into the main thrust of your question. You said that you've been championing participatory approaches, and that's so wonderful to hear. And I know that there are a lot of scholars and policymakers who are championing these approaches. However, usually these approaches are still very much focused on rational deliberation. maybe even confined just to scientific knowledge, because the rest is taken to be subjective and not relevant. There are participatory approaches that also encourage deliberation about values, but still emotions are met with suspicion there, which means that a lot of values will actually not get the attention they deserve, because they can best be revealed by reflecting on one's emotional experiences. Now, in terms of which developments do we see happening right now, a very straightforward one is, I think, the rapid development of AI. Indeed, there are a lot of ethicists who are now discussing the ethics of AI, and this boom has actually also led to more public attention to the ethical dimensions of technology, because in the past, actually, sometimes people were very surprised that there are people who are doing ethics of technology. Medical ethics has done a great job by making itself very prominent in policy considerations, a lot of times in politics, with elections, for example. When journalists and politicians talk about ethical issues, they mean medical ethical issues. But of course, every decision has ethical dimension, also every technology decision. And so does AI, for example, but it's not the only one. And I think on the one hand, it's great that AI now helps to bring ethics of technology more to the fore. But I think there's a danger that we forget about all the other technologies or other technology-induced developments, such as climate change, which is actually also exacerbated by AI developments, because AI uses even more energy resources than other digital technologies. And so any development in terms of AI, I think, should be considered also from an environmental perspective. Do we really need this AI technology? Of course, it's important to think about issues such as privacy and data protection. Super important, don't get me wrong. But maybe the first question should be, is this technology actually that useful for society that it legitimizes using such tremendous energy resources? And technologies such as Bitcoin, for example, I think maybe should just be completely prohibited, because they they use such huge energy resources. And here, I think, is a case where maybe we should be a bit more emotional. So don't get me wrong that I'm championing the emotions doesn't mean that I think emotions can't be misguided or biased. And I think it's very easy to get hyped up by something that is often in the media and forget about things that are not that much in the media. So here, I think there's also a normative role for ethicists, for example, to bring to the fore the ethical emergency related to climate change.
Absolutely. And I'm completely with you on understanding how participatory approaches may differ, and to put emotions at the center and to think of emotional deliberation as something very key and critical, and to do it in the right way. Yeah, your point on climate change, that also is very, very relevant. We seem to have forgotten in the age of AI that we have been facing multiple crises, and one of them, the biggest one probably, is climate change. So I also completely understand the need to focus on that, and to ask this question is so relevant, right? Whether this is something utility based, is it something that we need, or is it something that we really just want? And that's the need and the want conundrum, like you said about bitcoins, for example. As humans, and you're right that emotions could have possibly other side effects. Could you explore that a bit more for us? So is there a trap, or is there a downside to using emotions as sources of moral knowledge when we're navigating so many shifts?
Thank you. Yes. So I think emotions are crucial to emotional deliberation, but they can also lead us astray in archipels that are on the verge of disappearing because of sea level rises, due to climate change, due to technological developments, that these people actually only made a marginal contribution to. It's people developed in highly industrialized countries, and then they're also the wealthier people who have contributed most to climate change through the use of technology. Climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is a technology-induced phenomenon. Let's not forget about this. So this should be at the core and center of any ethics of technology. Okay, let's reflect on this technology, but what about the climate dimension? That should always be a question that we should ask ourselves. Yes, so the trap or downside of using emotions here could be that we are too much focusing on what is hyped up in the media. And again, this is a normative account, not a descriptive account. So it's really about how we should use the emotions, that they're often abused for manipulation and for very commercial purposes, for example, strategic purposes, is possible pitfall of the emotions, but for that shouldn't be a reason to dismiss emotions as such, as often is the case when people reflect on these kinds of bad examples of use of emotions, but rather it should be encourage us to appeal to emotions in a way that overcomes these biases. Again, here emotional deliberation plays an important role, listening to people's narratives, but also another topic that I mentioned also in one of the hashtags is the role of art, because works of art can also help us to reconsider our emotional experiences, to open our eyes to perspectives that we may want to shy away from, for example.
Indeed, I'm hearing a lot of openness, listening, very key basic things that we need to do as human beings, versus, of course, the manipulation that goes on and the misinformation, disinformation, and the kind of things that get traction nowadays in social media and in various circles. Um, you have such vast experience in this field. I'm sure you've already developed approaches that have been used in various spaces, maybe with policymakers, maybe with other stakeholders. And I was wondering if you could shed some light on the framework that we can use to support a systems change perspective, using emotional deliberation, and how can that be incorporated into policy advice?
Thank you. Indeed, I've contributed to several policy advisory committees related to technology developments or public health developments, and this is then my main contribution each time. Have been included in a lot of these reports as important insight. Have these things been implemented in practice? Maybe less than I would have hoped to. It also came recently to my attention that not only are the cycles of democratically elected governments short, and they have been much shorter in the Netherlands in the most recent years due to lots of political scandals. So we don't even manage the 4-year bar in politics, but in policy making, apparently, there's also a lot of rotation of policy advisors at ministries and other organizations, which means that a lot of the input may not make it to the next generation of policymakers. Yeah, so that's a bit sad that there's a lot of repetition in the message. The nice thing is that there's always renewed interest in these ideas, but yeah, one would hope that after some time you would build on the next steps, but that's not always the case.
Indeed, we need to find a way of stitching together the work that you've done and actually using it, because it seems to be the most natural way to think about things. But if you had, all the space and the biggest voice that was possible, and you could encourage public debate around one issue in this entire space, given your vast experience, and what would that be?
I think the most urgent topic would be to have a good sound deliberation on the energy transition, which is the vehicle with which we could do the most to mitigate climate change. And I'm emphasizing mitigation because we also are talking about climate change adaptation, but that sounds for me too much like already putting our head in the sand and giving up. I think we should do everything that we can to mitigate climate change, and energy, which energy technologies we use and what the energy technology mix is, and what maximum emissions we and energy use we actually find acceptable. I think these are crucial issues, and so it's basically 2 dimensions: how much energy should we use in total? My critical remarks about the enormous energy uses of AI and Bitcoin are related to that. So we are now seeing actually that we will that now technologies are hyped that will make our energy consumption only higher, which will exacerbate and make the decision making about the energy mix even more urgent. And then, of course, which technologies will we want to have in this energy mix? And these are very fundamental decisions where if you focus on one energy technology in isolation, it's very, very easy to dismiss it because every technology has its downsides and also every energy technology. Only if we see all these energy technologies in the context of the complete energy mix can we see, okay, but which pros and cons do we find most acceptable? Not just in a quantitative way, but also in terms of fairness issues. Where are the pros and cons more evenly distributed? So, for example, nuclear energy has enormous long-term implications also in terms of nuclear waste. So we burden future generations with the waste of our energy technologies. When it comes to wind energy, and of course, we have birds that may get killed from the rotating blades, so et cetera, et cetera. So every technology has these drawbacks, but we have to look at what do we find the most acceptable. And I think focusing on energy technologies where the implications are not in a way that we burden generations for thousands of years to come, that would be a big pro, I would say. And I think there should not be any discussion about outphasing fossil fuels. That debate has happened, but we see no action also in the recent COP agreements from the past days. By the time the podcast will be published, maybe this is a blast from the past, but I don't expect huge changes and new discussions. So there's even no discussion about fossil fuels because there's such a strong lobby, and it should be the other way around. It should be self-evident that we are going to phase out fossil fuels. Industrial countries are sponsoring fossil fuels in lots of ways. We could free those resources to invest in accelerating investments in solar energy and wind energy. And for example, the efficiency of solar energy has been so much higher than anybody predicted years ago. A colleague of us, Cornelis Block, has pointed that out in his farewell lecture as a full professor, which was really heartwarming to see that there are much more positive developments also possible. But if we outdo them by just consuming more energy, that's not going to work. I think this should encourage us to invest more in these technologies, but that requires a lot from all stakeholders, policymakers, industry, but also regular citizens, because everybody has a voice in these things.
Sabine, your approach to intergenerational justice is really refreshing. I completely agree with you. And in fact, we've seen climate change move from skepticism to acceptance, and now still a solutions-based approach is under deliberation. It really needs a lot of work. And I hope that your work will inform a solutions-oriented approach. Apart from climate change, if we today look at the kind of technological changes that are underway, and we spoke about media manipulation earlier. Could you imagine perhaps a future where almost science fiction in nature, where technology starts to intrude on and interfere with our human emotions and moral judgment? Today, I feel we still have control over what we feel and how we see things. But as technology takes over, especially AI and so on, we might be at risk of being told how to feel and what to feel. And I would love your insight on this.
Thank you. Actually, to be honest, I think we are in this situation. Also related to climate change, for example. I mean, most people who are well informed know that there's no doubt about this anymore. But then we see certain types of politicians who are propagating climate change denial also via social media. And that is getting traction. Of course, it's a comforting thought to think that it's not a problem. So just to put these two examples together, but also more in general, I think we already see that a lot of people are being manipulated emotionally and morally manipulated by it should be the other way around. It should be our emotions guiding our ethical values, providing ethical guidelines, restricting these technologies. So rather than the technology domineering our emotions should help keep the technologies in control. What can we do about it? Well, I think most importantly, it is important to see that we need to regulate technologies. We see what goes wrong if we don't. A lot of the digital technology technology companies are located in the United States, and those with the least regulation are the ones that do worst in terms of contribution to public decision making. Think about Twitter that got taken over by Elon Musk, who said no more redaction. You can say whatever you want, and the rest is history. We are seeing now with AI something that is almost invisible, but there are thousands of people working in these companies for these companies, also making sure that no extreme statements are adopted by AI, et cetera, et cetera. If we let that loose, which wouldn't surprise me that certain companies might want to have in the future, well, we can only start to imagine what this would mean to public discourse. So in that sense, I think the EU is here doing something really important by really being a front runner in terms of developing guidelines. And several of our colleagues, professors of ethics of technology, have also contributed to developing these guidelines. And I think we need stricter guidelines rather than less. But again, take emotions, emotional concerns such as solidarity and care, feelings of responsibility as input in developing such guidelines.
Indeed, I think we need all the help that we can get, especially when we want to talk about how to regulate, how to think about these big issues. But if I were to ask you, when you look ahead, what gives you the most hope in a future where humanity and human emotions are constantly in interaction with technology? What gives you the most hope, and what keeps you awake at night?
Thank you. Well, I am usually a very optimistic person, but I must say with the recent geopolitical developments, I find it harder and harder to be optimistic. But then there's another emotion coming up, and which is like a sense of let's try to change things even more urgently. So that's there's a positive emotional twist to this. And what still makes me hopeful is that there's so many new ethicists of technology entering the field and going on the job market in academia, but also in public policy, who have incorporated and also further contributed to the field of ethics of technology, and who will, I'm very convinced, make a very impactful, positive change in these developments. And what I also find very encouraging is that the topic of art and technology that I mentioned in passing earlier. So I'm glad to see that there's so many people now these days interested in art and the role of technology. And I think there's a lot of unexplored territory. And Radhika, I like that you said, yeah, we need all the forces that we can mobilize to make a difference here. And I completely second that. And I think bringing in the arts, bringing in emotions as sources of deliberation on values, I think these are all exactly because they are at the center of what it means to be a human being. And technology is not there for itself. Technology should help a lot of fantastic things. And most technology developers get into technology because they really want to change the world and make the world a better place. And technology has made so many fantastic positive impacts. Let's keep continuing this, and then humane technology developments fed by humane capacities, including our emotions, our creative and artistic endeavors to really contribute to the richest possible ethical deliberation.
Sabine, listening to you, something occurs to me on individual application. So, you, me, anyone, the layperson who wants to apply your approach of emotional deliberation, how can we do this in our everyday lives? What can we do on a daily basis so that we engage in emotional deliberation and are harnessing emotions for the common good, for our own good, and for the common good?
Thank you. Well, I guess actually maybe we're already doing this in a natural way most of the time in our private life. And it's maybe the other way around, expanding from there also to professional deliberations and public deliberations. So the way you discuss with your family members or with your loved ones or with your friends, when you want to go on a vacation together and somebody comes in and says, I have the solution. I found the perfect trip. We don't need to talk about it anymore. This is what we will do. That's probably going to be the end of the plans for the trip. and of the friendship, nobody in their right mind would do that, right? That's very, very clear for most of us, I would say. And well, the way we normally engage with each other is, we try to listen to each other. Hey, I have this idea. What do you think? What are your wishes? What are your preferences? How do you feel about it? Oh, now that I hear you, I can see, that I was maybe a little too rash and coming to this and this conclusion. Most of us do this pretty well in our daily lives, and maybe we should become better in doing this also at work, in professional conversations with our colleagues, if we are a manager with our employees, and vice versa, as employees with our manager, co-workers. I think there's already a lot of room for improvement, because in a professional setting, we don't use these skills as well as most of us do them in their private lives. Not everybody, of course, in their private lives, but most of us. And I think we hardly do that in public decision making. And it's not that hard, actually. It's like you summarized somewhere along the way, just be kind to each other, respectful, listen to each other, be caring. And that doesn't mean that anything goes. There's certain normative boundaries that we should be very clear about drawing. So if you're a racist or a sexist, I'm not going to be kind to these views. There we should be very forceful, but maybe we can help opening each other's eyes by pointing people to a good book or a good movie that is written or directed from the perspective of one of the people that a person has prejudice against. So also there's some room for helping each other without just being hateful to each other. And yeah.
Wow, that was so beautifully said, Sabine. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you on. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And your views are so refreshing, so insightful. And with all the warmth that you bring, we hope that emotions like compassion and care and the courage that you bring to this kind of permeate the atmosphere, and everybody can take those on so that we make a better world. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the very nice conversation, your kind words.
Thank you for listening to Disrupted Futures, a podcast brought to you by ESDiT. This episode was produced by Stella Pecchiaridi at the University of Twente's podcast studio. Did you enjoy this episode? Then do share it with someone who might like it too, and join the conversation through your comments. Stay curious, stay critical, stay tuned.